Alright folks, if there's one thing I've consistently seen in conversation within the Walking Dead fandom over the last couple years, it's the desire to see an animated series that adapts the comic run closer than the show. The idea had sprung up after the release of Invincible on Amazon Prime, another adaptation of a Robert Kirkman comic series that's seen crazy success since its premiere in 2021. So today, I thought it would be a fun idea to give my take on how I would structure an animated The Walking Dead series season by season. Now, unlike the original comic or AMC adaptation, this would be the first time the story of The Walking Dead would be started with the ending in mind. That is, if you don't count the deluxe series. The goal isn't to create the never-ending zombie story as proposed by Kirkman in the original comic run. Instead, we have an endgame that we're going to be actively heading towards. The intention of this video is to convey to whoever could be listening with the capability of making this happen over at AMC just how bad we as fans want to see a project like this happen. So today, I brought with me a couple of The Walking Dead content creators to give their input on what they would want to see most out of an animated series. So stick around to the end to hear their takes and drop them a sub while you're at it. Both of these guys are killing it and bring something unique to The Walking Dead fandom. Links to their channels will be in the description. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the comic series, it consists of 193 individual issues or 32 volumes, which is what I'm going to be using in reference to my structuring. If you're a fan of the adaptation on AMC, then you're probably going to be surprised to hear just how quick the pacing is in the comics compared to the show, especially in these early chapters. Realistically, you can read one of these volumes front to back within half an hour to 45 minutes. So my structuring of these seasons may seem like they're going at a breakneck pace, but remember, we have a story to tell here. We're not trying to drag anything out longer than it needs to be, so I believe the full story of The Walking Dead could be told within 7 seasons at roughly 10 episodes apiece. If we follow Invincible's trend of keeping episodes between 45 to 55 minutes, assuming it's aired on streaming rather than cable, I think that would be more than enough time to cover everything we need. Keep in mind, it's not like the series would be panel for panel. The writers, of course, would expand on things and trim down the fat when need be. Plots are allowed to be changed or remixed if they fit the episodic structure better, which is what I'll propose when warranted as we go along. The goal isn't to make a one-for-one copy of the comic, just to follow the plotline and characters much closer than we've seen before while making it consumable for a television format. So without further ado, let's get started. And obviously, spoiler warning for the entire comic series. I'm not going to hold back on anything as it's hard to structure plot lines without mentioning what would feature within. Now, this first season should give you guys a better idea of the pace I'd be moving at given I was in charge. I think Season 1 of The Walking Dead, the animated series, should cover everything from Volume 1 up to Volume 4. Now, hear me out. If we were going by the live-action show's pace, we'd essentially be ending our first season just before the Governor arc's beginning. That may seem crazy at first, but again, the comic moves at a much quicker pace than the show. Even after expanding on scenes along the way, I still think we'd have more than enough time to reach that point without rushing any plot lines. The idea would be to start the season with our characters optimistic help would come from the government eventually as believed by Shane, before slowly chipping away at that hope over the course of the season, ending with Rick declaring they are the Walking Dead and they are on their own in this new world. Your first episode could end at the beginning of issue 3 with Rick reaching the Atlanta camp, leading into episode 2 that features Rick and Glenn's return to Atlanta and ends with the camp massacre. Now, the first major change I would make to the story would be to keep Shane alive a little longer. Probably until the end of the farm, similar to the show. Having him die at the end of Volume 1 made for a rather fast and confusing turn on Rick. This way, we could give a bit more time to understand his love for Lori and develop his character into something memorable. Episode 3 would feature our characters searching for a home from place to place, the tragedy at Wiltshire Estates, and the introduction of Tyrese before ending with the shooting of Carl by Otis. Shane's presence here could make for a great avenue to further explore the prospect of the group believing the government would rescue them eventually as previously mentioned. kind of like how we see during a short time in the comic before creating more drama amongst the group as they head farther and farther away from the city to his displeasure, which would help drive in the "We are the Walking Dead" speech later, as our survivors would actively maintain hope for the first half of the season. Episode 4 would feature the entirety of Herschel and the farm story. The farm arc in the comics is only 3 issues long compared to the entire season the show got out of it, so this way we could get one really solid episode before moving on. And again, with Shane present here, you could do something like tie his optimism of rescue in with Herschel's belief the walkers weren't actually dead. Episode 5 could be made up of some original content as the group continues to search for a home after the farm, but the point of this episode would be to finally bring the death of Shane. Pretty much the same as it's portrayed in the comic, just at a different time and greatly expanded on before ending the episode with the discovery of the prison. You may be thinking, whoa, the prison already? Well, yeah. We actually reach it as early as issue 13 in the comics. So with this structuring, the first half of the season would focus on our group surviving from place to place while contemplating the idea of rescue coming, contrasted with the second half's themes of acceptance and fortification, as Rick encourages the rest of the group to come to terms with the state of the world following Shane's death. Episodes 6 to 10 would feature the taking and establishing of the prison, the prisoner's story arc, and the conflict between Tyrese and Rick. This might not seem like a lot of content, but if you were to expand on what was already there in volumes 3 and 4, I think you'd have more than enough material to end with Rick giving his iconic speech, finishing the season with the prospect of a much more brutal season 2 as our survivors have now accepted the reality of this world. I went episode by episode for the first half of the season to give you a clearer picture on how I'm imagining this could work, but for the subsequent seasons, I'll be more brief on its contents and just give a summary of how I think the season could flow as a whole. Now, Season 2 would of course feature the entirety of the Governor arc, ending with the destruction of the prison and the massacre that follows, aka everything from Volume 5 to Volume 8. With this structure, Michonne would have already been introduced in Season 1, so I would take advantage of some of this additional time to expand her character, and maybe tell the backstory with her daughters through flashbacks, which would be really cool given the hindsight knowledge of plotlines later to come. You could dedicate an episode or two to tell the story within the Governor novels, which I think would be desperately needed, as the Governor in his raw comic form is barely a character. He's kinda just a mustache-twirling force of evil until expanded on in said novels. The Martinez twist would be an awesome plotline to see on screen, and Michonne's torturing of the Governor would have people talking for weeks. But of course, as mentioned, it would all culminate with the bloodiest episode in the show, the Prison Massacre, setting us up for a Season 3 beginning in the Wasteland as we are left in the dark as to who survived. This season, of course, was all about learning how humans are just as dangerous as the dead. And going forward, we would see a very different Rick following the death of Lori and Judith and his failure as a leader through his descent into savagery. The Walking Dead the Animated Series Season 3 would feature its first half cover volumes 9 through 11, and its second half cover volumes 12 and 13, as we get 5 to 6 episodes of pure wasteland survival. I think the entirety of the Rick, Carl, and possibly even Michonne stuff could be told within a single episode if done right, with any leftover plot points such as the return to the farm and Abraham's introduction being remixed into episodes 2 and 3, which would cover the story of Volume 10, featuring Rick, Abraham, and Carl's journey back to King County, the retrieval of Morgan, and the conflict with the Marauders before culminating in a 2-part Fear the Hunters episode for the mid-season finale. One thing I absolutely adore from the show is the contrast of being on the road versus living within Alexandria in Season 5. So I would take those themes and absolutely run with it going into the second half as our characters reach the safe zone. Subsequent episodes would feature the stories of volumes 12 and 13. But I would expand on the parallels between Rick and Shane as Rick begins to pursue Jesse, with the season, of course, ending with the death of Pete Anderson, much like the show's Season 5 finale before teasing the presence of the mega herd near Alexandria. This structuring of the season would show just how far Rick has strayed from his original characterization as a lawful cop, and would plant the seeds for his taking of power within Alexandria next season, as we see just how far ahead his thinking is in relation to survival compared to the current leader. Now, Season 4 would be all about building Rick up just to tear him down, as we cover everything from Volume 14 to roughly halfway through Volume 17. I would tell the story of No Way Out over the first half of the season while remixing aspects of Volume 15 to take place before the Horde's arrival, like the civilians within the safe zone resisting Rick's leadership and whatnot, as episodes 3 through 5 feature the initial occupation of the dead around the walls, the invasion within, and the fight for Alexandria. This way, much like the AMC adaptation, No Way Out ends with the majority of Alexandria's population accepting Rick as their leader, instead of some resisting it and blaming him for their misfortunes. And now, heading into the second half of the series, our characters would come to the realization the dead were a manageable threat. So naturally, the following half season would be about Rick's overconfidence as we're introduced to Jesus and the Hilltop, who strike a deal with our survivors to handle a group known as the Saviors that have been causing trouble in the Washington area. I think you guys already know where this is going. The Season 4 finale would feature the iconic lineup in its entirety. No teasing the death or any BS like that. I'm a huge fan of contrasting themes throughout a season, so seeing Rick, who has been acting as if they are on top of the world, brought to tears would be just as powerful as it was in the live-action adaptation. And of course, Season 5 would feature the entirety of the Savior and War arc, making for what would probably be a fan-favorite season if done correctly. Which might seem insane for some of you show-only fans, but for the comic readers out there, you already know the potential the story arc could hold. One solid complete season of Negan and the Saviors covering everything from the second half of Volume 17 to Volume 21 would not only fix a lot of the pacing issues people had with the adaptation, but would maintain that contrasting themes pattern we have going on in most seasons, as the first half would feature Negan's rule over our survivors, while the second half would feature the Resistance, culminating in the arrest of Negan as Rick begins to look toward building a real future. I honestly think the story from what would be seasons 3 to 5 of the show is nearly perfect. There's very little I think would need to be changed in terms of the story and characters, with the exception of elements within Volume 15 as previously mentioned. But here is where things might get a bit more complicated. The Whisperer arc in its entirety takes place over 7 volumes, while the Commonwealth arc takes place over 4. I think in order to properly end the series without adding any unnecessary seasons, the final 2 should feature an additional 2 episodes each to tell their stories without dragging anything on longer than it needs to be, bringing the episode count up to 12 for both remaining chapters. Now, this might be one of the more controversial aspects of my structuring, but as mentioned, with only 2 seasons left in my version of the show, Season 6 would include the majority of the story from Volume 22 to 28, which would feature the New Beginning story introduction, the Whisperer arc, the Whisperer War, and the Horde's occupation of Alexandria. Which, trust me, I know, at first that sounds like way too much content for one season, even with 2 additional episodes. But if you were to make some changes, trim the fat, and relegate a few smaller subplots to the final season, I think you could be left with an action-packed, fast-paced 12-episode run. The point of the Whisperer arc is to grow Rick as a leader and set him up to be the world-changing figure we see by the end. So, of course, I believe the best place to end this season to make it feel like a complete story would be at Andrea's death. Again, this would be a fast-paced, action-packed chapter of the show, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you think this arc should be split into 2 separate seasons. But in my opinion, there's just not quite enough content to justify that, but also a bit too much to keep the 10-episode structure. As mentioned, you could definitely move some subplots such as the Savior Rebellion to the beginning of Season 7, which would shift like half of Volume 28 alone, And honestly, you could probably tell the story of Volume 25 featuring the immediate aftermath of the Pikes and Rick's regaining of trust among the Coalition within a single 55-minute episode if you move a couple things around. However, one thing I believe actually needs to be expanded on is Negan's time with the Whisperers. He never even gets his own skin in the comics, which is such a missed opportunity. But again, it's okay if you disagree and think this season should be split into two. It is a lot of content to cover. Although, if planned out and remixed properly, I think this could make for a legendary penultimate season. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. However, in what would be the 7th and final season, we kind of have the opposite problem Season 6 had. The Commonwealth arc in the comics is largely regarded as a rush story for many fans, so I think this is the part of the series that would need the most expanding on by the writers to keep engaging, as we of course cover everything left over from Volume 28 to Volume 32. They would have the advantage of advertising it as the final season, opposed to the comic that seemed to just be chugging along with a mid-arc before its abrupt ending. So I think playing into the story winding down would really help with its perception by fans. Rick hangs out at Alexandria doing nothing for like 2.5 of the 4 volumes in this final stretch as he is grieving Andrea's death. So I think that could be watered down to an episode or 2 before he makes his way to the Commonwealth and uses that grief as motivation. This way he can spend quite a bit more time falling in love with the city and influencing its politics. I really love how the show ties the Whisperer's destruction into the Coalition's acceptance of the Commonwealth, so I think I would try to find a way to incorporate those elements as well. And one thing that would basically be required would be to have an episode dedicated to Negan's ending, which I think could actually work in an interesting way if they tied the Here's Negan backstory into it, kind of like a seeing the beginning at the end sort of thing. If they really wanted to, they could set up a Negan Lives spin-off, but to be honest, I'd be more focused on just telling the story presented first. Now, judging by the comments on my comic ending explain video, Rick's death is extremely controversial, but I would confidently say I wouldn't change it at all. Well, except maybe develop Sebastian as a character more, but I think that's kind of a given if we're expanding on the source material. I think it's a great ending for his character as he survived to a point where he felt like he could just live again and let his guard down, but I understand why others don't like it. That's why this final season would be all about building up to that point and establishing Rick's legacy. As for the final issue's adaptation, there's a couple things you could do. A, make an extended finale, or B, make a movie. Personally, I'd rather they just make an extended finale, as a movie could make it seem like the start of something rather than the end, but hey, maybe they'd want to do that. Turning the final issue into a backdoor pilot for a sequel series could work if that's the direction they chose to take. But with that, my version of The Walking Dead the animated series would come to an end at 74 episodes. Of course, they could make spin-offs based on things like Clementine's story or Negan Lives, but at least the main story would be completed in its entirety. Now, I've given my thoughts on how I would remix things or adapt plotlines to enhance the story or make it flow better, such as keeping Shane alive longer, including elements from the novels and one-off comics, and expanding on the Commonwealth arc as a whole. But what do I personally want to see more than anything? Well, I want to see them fix Beta's ending. And honestly, the Whisperer's ending as a whole. I hate that they're pretty much made extinct by the end of the arc, but let's just focus on the big guy here. To me, his character is one of the coolest concepts in the series. But good God, his final confrontation in the comic is terrible. Jesus and Aaron go out camping after the Whisperers are defeated, before randomly encountering Beta, who is taken out by a single bullet and dies yelling like a child about having no name. I think his death is honestly kinda meh in the show too, but it's 100% better than the comic. A couple options to improve it: have Beta simply die at the ending of the Whisperer War. Instead of sending the Mega Horde into Alexandria to finish the job, have the Whisperers in the walls stabbing people and opening doors, culminating in a final confrontation between Beta and Negan. Alternatively, you could do something like keep him alive, but turn him into an urban legend in the woods. Like, have our survivors regularly encounter him almost like a serial killer who just always slips away. I'm imagining a scene where a group of Alexandrians sitting around a fire spook each other with ghost stories of Beta coming for those who find themselves outside the walls at night. Kind of like the boogeyman or something. I don't know, I feel Beta in the comics is just wasted potential as a whole, so I'd love to see them fix his story, or at the very least, his ending. I'm now gonna pass the conversation off to my fellow The Walking Dead content creators. Jerry's Takes and Theo Hunt will both speak their piece on what they would want to see adapted or changed most in an animated series, but I highly encourage you guys to do the same in the comments below. The only way AMC will know we want this is if we make enough noise. So once again, huge thanks to both of these guys for coming on. Definitely be sure to drop them each a sub on your way out.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello, I am Jerry from Jerry's Takes. Hi to all of you who may know who I am. If you don't, I talk about The Walking Dead and other shows all the time. But Ty came to me asking for my thoughts on what I would like to see from a Walking Dead animated series that follows the comics. And if you guys have been following my channel, I'm very vocal about this. I think Robert Kirkman's story is literally perfect in every which way. So I wouldn't change a thing from the comics. I think everything that we got in that story is just absolutely magnificent. From Andrea to Carl and the way it ended to even Rick's demise in that story, there isn't one thing I would change. I would love to see all of it. The only thing that I would consider altering a little bit is maybe Shane, because AMC's The Walking Dead Shane is a phenomenal addition to that show, and one that is greatly missed in The Walking Dead's comics. I guess you could also argue that's the same with the intro itself, and how in the comics the intro into the apocalypse is literally 1 page long. Probably I'd extend those two things out a little bit, but that's it. I would keep everything else the same. The Pikes, Andrea's death, Rick's death, Carl being the end of the story, all of it. We show all of it, because that's what makes Robert Kirkman's comics so great. Thanks, Ty, for having me on. Hope to see you on my channel.
What's up, guys? It's Theo here from the YouTube channel Theo Hunt. And one thing I'd love to see above all else from a Walking Dead animated series is the tone of the comics incorporated into a show. For example, the Governor is extremely toned down in his last TV adaptation, so seeing him in his authentic and original state I think would not only be fascinating, but would also make for some incredibly tense scenes. Now, albeit I don't reckon they could show all of what he did, but I hope the show has the same brutality and realness that the comics have. I would also like the story to delve into different plot points that weren't explored within the TV show. More specifically, the character of Thomas Richards, who I think would not only make for an amazing villain, but would also give the viewers more unease during the prison era, and represent to us how much more bleak and dark the world of the comics are. And lastly, maybe asking a little bit too much, but I'd pay every single penny in my bank account to have the TV show actors voice their animated counterparts. Is it realistic? No. Do I want it to happen? Well, hell yeah. Just think how awesome it would be to hear Andrew Lincoln voice Rick Grimes again. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to Ty Swell for having me on the channel, and I'll see you all later.
Alright folks, now before I let you go, I had a creator reach out to me with a Clementine fan film they had put together, and honestly, if there's one thing I've seen the fanbase want even more than an animated series, it's a Telltale live-action adaptation. Michael Phoenix has clearly put a lot of love, passion, and time into this, and it shows with its production value. So definitely be sure to check it out after this video. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.